consumer surveys across India actually show that Indians are more willing to spend on education than anything else. It is our responsibility to ensure that zip codes, backgrounds, that they don't determine destiny, that poverty doesn't determine destiny. What people basically need is something to be able to dream towards. People need basically the ability to be able to hope.
Right.
And I think that's what examples have the power to be able to do, right? Like that's what excellent schools have the power to do. That's what basically kids who are actually able to prove our economy has changed, our place in the world has changed, the list of challenges we have to solve have changed, right? Like there's so much that's fundamentally different.
Sure.
But our schools, and I say this out of somebody who's been into schools probably every single week for the past 17 years that I've been here, have largely stayed the same. But it does mean as long as we accept the argument that all kids from low-income backgrounds just need the basics, we're never actually going to leapfrog as a country. I think there's actually a lot of assets in India that we can tap into, right? And I think while we're further behind the curve, I think there's a lot of room to say, do we need to basically take the same trajectory of playing catch up with the US and with the West, or can we leapfrog in ways? And the question's then, how do you leapfrog?
Sure, yeah.
Right? And that, I think, lies in, well, one, how do we reinvent the purpose of our schools? How do we reinvent schools that they're preparing kids for the future and not for the past? And how do we start to leverage things like technology that maybe can help us to be able to catapult along the way? We need to reinvent the state of school across this country and across the world. We have a lot of talent in this country that's capable of doing so much. And reinventing has to go through our people.
What does it take to transform an entire education system? How do we ensure that each child gets equal opportunity irrespective of their background? Today, we're going to dive into these topics with someone who spent more than a decade transforming and reimagining the Indian education system. Welcome, guys. I'm your host, Jasmine Kaur. Welcome to the Rising Immigrant Show. Today, I'm joined with Sandeep Rai. He is the CEO and founder of The Circle, and he was also instrumental in shaping Teach for India. Since 2008, Sandeep has played a pivotal role in shaping Teach for India's mission and has impacted millions of students across the country. Now, through The Circle, he's working towards reinventing schools and creating a future-ready education system. In today's conversation, we're going to dive into Sandeep's personal journey. We're going to talk about his cross-cultural experience, why he decided to move to India and work on the education system. And also, we're going to take on some key topics like the differences between the Indian and American education system, the role AI and automation is going to play, and how it's going to transform the education system now. So let's dive in. Please allow me to welcome my guest, Sandeep Rai. Sandeep, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me here. It's good to be here.
Yeah, it's an absolute pleasure. And we're doing this in Gurgaon, guys, in India. And Sandeep usually spends most of his time in Mumbai. So we're very honored to have him in our house studio. So I'm excited to know more about you, learn more about you. So tell me, Sandeep, where were you born and what was childhood like for you?
Yeah, I was born in the U.S., born and raised in the southern part of the U.S., went to college in New Orleans, grew up in a very traditional Indian family, grew up basically thinking that I would go into medicine actually,
Sure.
And that I would become a doctor. So I know that that's probably not a narrative that many Indian Americans are used to, a narrative many Indian Americans are used to, but I grew up essentially, believing and thinking that I had a brother that's a doctor and a sister that's a doctor. And so I was influenced a lot by the world of medicine growing up.
So I know you went to Columbia University.
Yes.
And then you worked as a teacher at a school in Washington, D.C.
Yes.
What led you to that path? And then we're going to go to the next part on why you decided to move to India.
Yeah, so I had an epiphany a couple of months before I was supposed to graduate college. And this was me still thinking that I would be going to medical school. And I realized that I was doing it for all reasons that just didn't feel right anymore. At the last minute, I kind of decided that, I wanted to teach instead. So I had a series of very difficult conversations with my parents and decided to teach in the heart of DC. I taught in a school through Teach for America.
Right.
That was tough and challenging by every means possible. Just to give you a sense, there are 238 schools in DC, and this school was actually ranked number 238 out of 238 on academics.
Oh, wow.
And it was ranked close to that on safety. And so a lot of people are like, what does it mean to be ranked so low on safety? It meant that, we had kids getting arrested. It meant that we had police officers roaming the hallways. It meant that I was spending about a third of my time in my first year actually just breaking up fights. That experience was challenging, but it taught me so much. And I think it shaped the person that I became. I think it taught me that kids are capable of anything, right? And kids are kids.
Right.
And kids, it is our responsibility to ensure that zip codes, backgrounds, that they don't determine destiny, that poverty doesn't determine destiny. And they taught me that schools hold enormous power in being able to drive that, right?
Right.
And schools have power to either be transformative, which they can be, but they also have the power to be catastrophic. And usually the difference between those two are the people leading the school and the teachers within the school.
Right.
And I think that realization very early on, coupled with this realization that the effects of poverty are just very, very real on kids, and they're very real on families. And I think all of that cemented this resolve to say, you know what, I'm going to be spending a lifetime within education because of the deep belief that actually education can be such a big driving force for poverty. Shortly after that, I jumped on a plane, kind of on a whim, actually, to come to India. Someone connected me and said, there's this person in India. Her name is Shaheen Mistry. She's trying to start this organization called Teach for India. Would you be willing to, go out, help get it off the ground? And spoke with Shaheen, and I was like, look, I'll come for a year, and then I'll go back to the U.S. And that going back never happened. That was 17 years ago.
Wow.
Yeah.
So when you were making this transition, were there any challenges?
Yes, many. It was I hadn't been back to India since I was 4.
Wow.
Right. And I moved when I was 22. And so, culturally, it was a very different world. I think understanding the education system, dealing with, what are the very, very big depths of poverty and trying to wrap my head around that, but also confronting that in very real ways through our schools and our communities. Yeah, I think all of those proved to be challenging, not to mention that, I was thousands of miles away from family
home.
members and all of that. Yeah.
So most immigrants think about building a life in the US, right?
Yeah.
I'm sure if your parents immigrated, it was a big dream for them.
It was a big dream, yeah.
And big part of that is making sure that your children get the right education and fulfill that American dream.
Yeah.
When you moved here to India, did you question yourself ever or repeatedly on why you made that bold decision?
Yeah, of course. My parents thought I was crazy. And I think a lot of my family also thought I was crazy. They were just like, why are you doing this? And I think, at several points I questioned it, and at several points I said, is this the right move? Should I be spending my time in the US? But I don't know, it felt right. I think it felt right. I think I, fell in love with the community, with culture, with the people. I also just fell in love with the work, to be honest, and I think that need and the potential is so high.
Right.
And the potential to be able to grow is so high. I think that just fueled me. Yeah.
Got it. So I know you've worked in the slums of Delhi.
Yeah.
You write about that in your book, Grey Sunshine. And you've also written about the profound effect it has had on you and your way of thinking. Talk to me about that. What were some of the stories that you came across while you were working in these underserved areas?
So, I'll tell you one story, I think, so I wrote this book about 7 years ago, and I spent time actually, both day and night in communities just to try to spend time getting to know kids, trying to spend time to capture those stories.
Sure.
And one of those communities is actually in the heart of Bombay. And so this book actually follows 3 kids in 3 different communities, right? So one is in the heart of Bombay in Govandi,
Right.
which is one of India's largest slum populations. The second one is actually in Jahangirpuri in Delhi. And the third one is in Pune. And the way this community in Bombay is structured is it has a density of population that is 3 times anywhere else you would be in the city. Right? And Bombay is a pretty densely packed city. It has a mortality rate that is 39 years of age. It has rates of disease that you basically would compare to parts of sub-Saharan Africa. You have an apothecary or a chemist, I think, that are basically like at a fraction of the distance that you would find healthcare anywhere outside of this community. And the way that the community works is it's actually sitting right next to this landfill. It's called the Dionar landfill. And all of the city's trash of Bombay gets dumped in this one big landfill. And so as a result of that, the closer that you actually live to that landfill, the cheaper your rent is.
Oh.
And the farther away you live from the landfill, the more expensive it is. And that's actually because in the summer months, what ends up happening is the landfill gets combustible.
Oh.
And so the trash basically starts to be able to basically turn into fire. It rises and the ash starts to sprinkle down on the residents around it. And so I'm in this community and I meet, I'm trying to basically talk with kids and everybody keeps telling me that you need to chat with this child, Mehek. And I keep saying, actually, you have to find basically this child. You have to be able to talk to her. And so I keep, talking to this child and I'm sitting there getting to know her and I start to see why people love her, right? She's got this incredible smile. She like lights up a room when she's talking to you. She puts you at ease. She's telling me, our favorite book is Harry Potter. Her favorite, she loves Finding Nemo. And at some point she's like, do you want to basically come and see my house? And so I'm like, yeah, sure. I'd love to. I'd love to come and see your house. Love to meet your mom. And so we start walking through this community and we get to Mehek's house. And Mehek's house is actually maybe 150 meters away from this landfill. And we're sitting there and we're talking and her father's a rag picker and her mom, cuts cardboard boxes for a living. And we're sitting in that house and we're chatting for a while. And after a little while, her mom looks at me and she says, all these teachers, they keep coming up to me and they keep saying, we want Mehek to go to college. We want Mehek to go to college. And she said, some days, to be honest with you, like I really believe them. And some days I'm like, I'm all excited. But most days I think it's a joke. And I was like, well, why would you think that this is a joke? And she says, because if you would actually see where we've stayed and where we've lived before we got to this tin shed, and if you would understand what our families have been through, you would understand that college is such a distant dream for us. And she slows down and she looks down and she looks back up at me and she says, look, every single day we do one big thing. We wake up and we pray for a blessing because that's what it's going to take to be able to get us through this day. And when I think about that story, like I walked out of that community thinking like the fact that kids actually have to basically grow up confronting that, the fact that basically like oppression is so real is something that we need to figure out how to urgently solve,
I can't even imagine living in that situation and still believing something's possible. You've talked about hope a lot, right? You've talked about the ability of hope motivating people and giving them an outlet. How do you think it has transformed people's life, or what does it really offer to people who have nothing else to look up to?
Yeah, so while I was in Jahangirpuri, actually, I was talking with kids and I kept basically trying to ask parents and kids, like, do you know of a child who's actually getting an excellent education? Can you tell me of a school that's really great? And they kept actually all pointing to this one child, and this child's name was Soni. And so I kept trying to find out where this child was, right? And what I eventually discovered over time was that Soni actually lived some 15 kilometers away from where these parents and these families stayed. And I was enthralled about the fact that this entire community was pointing to this one child who they basically didn't really know that well, who was 15 kilometers away, right?
And why was that?
Because Soni had actually gotten into a Pratibha school, which is a very well-known, high-performing government school. They found out and they knew that actually she was able to speak English. They knew that basically she was able to, get a good education. They knew that she was very likely to be able to go to college. And so she became a bit of folklore in that community. Right? She became something that basically all kids aspired to. And that was what struck me the most, because as I started to basically walk around that community, I thought most about the fact that like what people basically need is something to be able to dream towards. People need basically the ability to be able to hope.
Right.
And I think that's what examples have the power to be able to do. Right? Like that's what excellent schools have the power to do. That's what basically kids who are actually able to prove that poverty doesn't have to dictate destiny have the power to be able to do. They're able to basically provide hope. And I think one of the worst things that you can do in a community is basically remove the ability to hope. And so the question that we continue to hold is, while you can't change India overnight, how do we actually build up enough hope to where we can actually start to build a movement for change for people that actually really want to affect change?
Right.
You
So
know?
you think hope drives, people to get out of their situation and do something more for them, and to have positive examples in the community is a direct sort of way to do that.
I think hope changes the conversation. I think when you basically look across the country right now, I think we could easily argue that your average Indian citizen, many of us basically just don't believe that it is possible for a child from a low income background to get an excellent education and to climb the ladder of social mobility, right? It's just not a believable piece,
Right.
right? And I think we've largely accepted that, well, poverty is defining, that poverty is destiny.
Right.
And I think to be able to break that, I think we need to be able to provide example after example that something else is possible. Provide examples of kids that are breaking that, provide examples of schools that are breaking that. Can we eventually provide examples of entire cities that are showing that actually excellent education can transform lives at scale? And I think when we can do that, then we can start to change the conversation. We can change the conversation from, wait a minute, is this possible? To, we know that this is possible. We know that it can actually happen at scale. The question is, how do you do it for all kids? And I think that that level of hope to change the conversation needs to happen at every level. I think it needs to happen with families and parents, because then families start to demand more.
Sure.
Right? I think it needs to happen for citizens at large. I think it needs to happen for governments. I think it needs to happen at every level.
So how do you find a practical way of doing that? You've worked at grassroots level, right? And transformed many schools through Teach for India and now through the Circle. Talk to me about, what does this dream school look like? What are we aspiring to offer at these schools so that we're able to offer these children the hope or the abilities to grow?
So first of all, I think you need both bottoms up change as well as top down change, right? I think you need grassroots. You need schools that basically are proving what's possible one school at a time.
Sure.
But you also need deep government intervention coming from the top down, where you have governments locking hands to say, we're actually going to make big changes to try to shift education at scale. I think what schools have the power to do are be North Stars, examples for governments to learn from. And so to your question, well, what does that dream school look like? Well, I think the question that we're holding right now at the Circle is, are schools serving kids for an India that exists today? Right? And when we unpack that a little bit, we have to acknowledge that India has changed quite dramatically
Absolutely.
over the last 75 years, right? When I think about the India my parents grew up in, when I think about, the India that existed when we started to push to democratize schooling
Sure.
some 60 years ago, like that India was very, very different than the India that exists today. Our economy has changed. Our place in the world has changed. The list of challenges we have to solve have changed, right? Like there is so much that's fundamentally different.
Sure.
But our schools, and I say this out of somebody who's been into schools probably every single week for the past 17 years that I've been here, like have largely stayed the same.
Really?
They've been somewhat stubbornly obstinate and a relic of the past, right? And to basically give you a quick example of this, right? Like there's an employer survey that comes out every single year, right? And you see it blasted on the Times of India. Happens in multiple countries. And that question goes something along the lines of, what are the top 3 skills that kids should be graduating with, right? And employers answer this, and for every year they've been answering it. And you go back to the 1960s when they first started to answer that question, and what do you think the top 3 skills were back in the 1960s?
I would think about mathematics, reading abilities, maybe, history.
Yeah.
I would assume.
Yeah. So reading with a focus on nonfiction,
Okay.
mathematics with a focus on computational arithmetic,
Okay.
and writing with a focus on penmanship, right? Fast forward, right, 60 years later, what do you think employers are saying now?
Is it still the same?
No.
I mean, I would assume there's lots of changes given there's AI, there's automation,
Yeah,
the world
there's a
around
lot
us
of
has
that,
changed.
yeah.
I mean, computer skills are very important given the world
Yeah.
we live in today. There's no job which pays you well and works without you having to work on a laptop. I mean,
Yeah.
what did you guys observe?
Yeah, so what we're discovering from employer surveys across the world and in India. So one is creativity, and defining creativity as a creation of 0 to 1. Can I build something from scratch?
Uh,
Original thinking, right? Two is cognitive empathy, with the thinking being that if I can empathize with my neighbor, I can more likely work in teams,
Sure.
right? And the third is complex problem solving.
Mm-hmm.
And now the question is, what is the vast majority of Indian schools preparing kids for? The 2022 world or the 1960 survey? Going into schools mostly, like it's the 1960 survey that we're still preparing kids for.
Oh,
And so the question is then basically, how do schools evolve? That
right.
does not mean that the basics don't matter. That does not mean that we basically don't need to empower kids to be able to read and to be able to think quantitatively.
Right.
But it does mean as long as we accept the argument that all kids from low income backgrounds just need the basics, we're never actually going to leapfrog as a country.
Sure. I mean, I would be able to, I think we can generalize to all groups, like
Yeah.
all different sectors of the society, not
Yeah.
just the underserved communities.
It's everybody.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's everybody.
Yeah.
And that was going to be my next question. So you have lived in America.
Yes.
You worked as a teacher in Washington, D.C. Then you moved here since the last, 17 years. You worked in the schools in India. What are the key differences do you see in the education system in the US? You just talked about the system here in India. But
Yeah.
what are the differences and what can we learn from the American education system?
I think the questions that we're holding is also how do you leapfrog this over time? And I want to get into that in a second, but to get to the learnings piece first, I think that levels of poverty in India are much deeper, right? And they're
Right.
much wider, right? And I think that very much impacts how education is delivered. I think that infrastructure curriculum are much further behind, right? I think that what you don't find as often in Indian schools and communities, which you find a lot in US schools and communities, I think that you find a lot of violence in American schools and communities that even I, when I was teaching, basically discovered a lot of. You don't find that as much, right? I think you also find a deep investment in education in Indian communities that you don't find as much.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And I think that like consumer surveys across India actually show that Indians are more willing to spend on education than anything else, including healthcare, right? And that's largely because of the belief that education holds a ticket to opportunity,
Right.
right? You don't find that as much across the US, right? You don't find the deep, deep belief that actually it can be transformative, actually, And part of that is because the provision of it, the delivery of it has become so widespread that actually it's just taken as a right, right? In India, that hasn't happened as ubiquitously yet, right? And so I think there's actually a lot of assets in India that we can tap into, right? And I think while we're further behind the curve, I think there's a lot of room to say, do we need to basically take the same trajectory of playing catch up with the US and with the West, or can we leapfrog in ways? And the question's then, how do you leapfrog?
Sure. Yeah.
Right? And that I think lies in, well, one, like, how do we reinvent the purpose of our schools? How do we reinvent schools so that they're preparing kids for the future and not for the past? And how do we start to leverage things like technology that maybe can help us to be able to catapult along the way?
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
In your book, The Grey Sunshine, you have mentioned several stories, as we spoke about earlier as well. Is there a story that has stayed with you and changed your perspective about life? Is there something that you have held closer to you and has helped guide you in your personal journey?
Yeah. I mean, many of the stories I think from that time actually really shaped me and just stirred my soul, to be honest, because I think I spent a lot of time just listening to kids and to families and to parents and to teachers, I think a couple that stand out, I think that one was actually in Jahangirpuri from a girl that I met and followed around for a while and was able to basically learn her story and learn, a lot about her growing up. And she grew up in a very, very conservative family that like really didn't believe that education would be transformative for her,
Oh,
And I remember being at her school, which was a school in the heart of Jahangirpuri, and like you saw basically nobody teaching. And you saw levels of violence kind of spread across this school that were actually quite unparalleled. And I remember sitting with her father that one evening and her father basically sitting there with me and saying, like we're thinking about pulling her out of school. And like I got into this big debate with him and I was just like, why would you think about pulling her out of school? Like, and he looked at me and he says, you just spent the past few hours at that school. do you honestly think that that school is giving my child a better education than what we could basically give outside of that school? And it was a question I found hard to answer after
Yeah.
spending a couple of hours at that school. And yet this child was sitting there arguing with her dad, saying, like, please don't pull me out. Like, I will make my own way. I will figure out how to study the curriculum. I will figure out how to make my way through it. And afterwards, she pulls me aside and she said something to me that I'll never forget. She says, you know, I fought enough battles with my family over the years, and I fought enough battles at school. And she was 12. And she said, I want to tell you one thing I've learned over time. And she said, I've learned that I have to be a one-woman army. And she said, I've learned that basically if I really want to be able to make my dreams come to life, I have to figure out how to basically shape them for myself. And I left that thinking like,
Wow.
wow, like think of the resilience and the perseverance that child has. But I also left thinking like, no kid should have to feel that, you know, like what does it mean to surround kids with an ecosystem of support that is rooting for them? Yeah.
I mean, that coming from a 12-year-old, I can't even imagine. But
Yeah.
if you were to look at the positive side of it, that's a lot of conviction.
A
And
lot of conviction.
that, I mean, going back to what we were talking about, I mean, if you have hope for your future, if you can dream big,
Yeah.
you can pretty much achieve everything, right? You might have to fight a lot of battles, as she said, but
Yeah.
there is a path forward for you. So, Sandeep, in your book, you talk about how there's this perception that people who are not in the top strata
Yeah.
or who are not doing well in their lives, it's because of their own shortcomings or it's because it's their fault.
Yeah.
Right? That they don't work hard enough. But what I've seen is that people who are in the lower income groups actually work the hardest. You
Yeah.
talked about like a cardboard cutter mom who was a cardboard cutter, dad
Yeah.
who did like, you know, pick up trash for living. I mean, I don't think anybody's working harder outside in the sun.
Yeah.
But there's a common misconception or a perception that it's because of their own sort of, you know, shortcomings. What do you have to say about that?
So I was with a child just last week, I think, that really shifted a little bit of how I see this. And she said there's no such thing as the voiceless. They're just people who refuse to listen. I thought there was so much power in that and so much truth in that, you know? Look, I think that what you have in India is you have a tiered system where you have kids that go to government schools, but you also have a growing affordable private school market, right? And the way a lot of these schools work is that once parents have enough buying power to be able to basically afford a private school, they usually almost always take their kids out of a government school, right? And so in some cities, you're left with private schools actually serving 65 to 70% of the population. And what I think that leaves you with is it leaves you with your government schools serving your most marginalized, right? And I think because of that, I think anytime families get the power to be able to exercise their voice, they end up exercising their voice for a different school system. And so I think to be able to basically address that, I think we need to figure out how to like empower families at all levels to be able to exercise their voice, to be able to demand for change. So that goes to the first part of what you said around voice. I think that there are structures and systems that are at play that do create an unfair advantage, you know?
Right.
And I think that, you know, when you basically look at what's happening with families, I think we have to ask ourselves, like, what does it take to be able to elevate their voices so that they're able to demand for greater
Give them the
change?
power.
Yeah.
Putting the mic in front of them so they can voice
Yeah.
their concerns or what they would like their, you know, community to
Precisely.
look like or the schools to look like in the first place.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah.
And so when you started working with Teach for India and also when you were developing the circle, you must have had this vision, right? Like something that you're going to work towards.
Yeah.
What was that? How has that evolved over time? And what has changed? Like maybe you set out thinking a certain way and that changed over time because you experienced something different on ground.
So I think I started the circle about 3.5 years ago. And that was really built off of a couple of core beliefs, right? That started to evolve at a very personal level over time. One of those is that school as we know it is just going obsolete. Like schools need to be reinvented,
Sure.
right? And the second of those is that, well, when we think about the very purpose of schooling, we need to recognize that kids growing up in today's world are inheriting a long list of challenges and issues that they will have to figure out how to solve. Right? Pick an issue, pick global warming, pick climate, pick poverty, right? Pick basically, increasing effects of globalization. Like we could go on for a while.
Sure.
And kids growing up today will have to figure out how to solve some of those issues because as adults, those issues will outlive us. Right? And if we accept that premise, then we also need to accept that our kids need to be prepared to be able to tackle them.
Right.
They need to be equipped to be able to solve some of the world's most pressing challenges and excited about solving some of the world's most pressing challenges. And when you look at that and you look at what's happening in schools today, it's very hard to argue that our schools are prepared to help kids solve some of the world's toughest challenges.
Sure.
Our schools are structured around a purpose of how do I develop a better me? How do I, better achieve? How do I get better grades? How do I basically succeed at an individual level?
Right, but that can't work without you having an understanding of the world around you because
Exactly. And so what does it take to be able to empower kids to say, actually, in addition to thinking about how do I develop a better me, how do I also shape futures around me? How do I shape my community into a better place? How do I start to think about my relationship with the community and the world around me? And how do I realize actually that I have the agency to drive change at any point? And can we stop looking at school as, hey, this is a machine or this is an institution that is going to spend the next 16 years of your life preparing you for someday in the future, and actually say, wait a minute, as kids, you're actually capable of a lot. And so can we start to empower kids to be able to affect change even as children and believe that kids are actually capable of changing the world? Believe that kids are capable of much more than we give them
giving
credit
them the
for.
autonomy, like giving them that power.
Giving autonomy and giving agency, yes. And so the second big belief that we operate with is that schools just need to evolve,
Sure.
right? The purpose of school needs to evolve. And the third big belief that we operate with is that this has to happen through people. Like you cannot circumvent that route. And India's people are the greatest solution to being able to help India leapfrog. And so we cannot reinvent our schools unless it is done through local leadership, local talent, local principals, local teachers. And so a lot of what we build at the Circle is rooted around some of those key fundamental beliefs.
So taking in the community partners with you
Precisely.
and having your community sort of look at their own issues and trying to find ways to solve them. Is that what
Precisely.
I'm hearing?
Yes.
Okay. That's really helpful. If I was to condense what we just talked about, we talked about your personal experiences, we talked about what learnings you had at the grassroots level while you were interacting with these students. We also talked about the difference in the education system in India and America. I wanted to touch on like a few key takeaways. If you were to take, for somebody listening to this and interested in improving the educational quality in India, right? If you were to reimagine this whole system, what would be the key takeaway? And the second piece of it is if you were to look back in time, right? If you were to look back at your trajectory, is there anything you would do differently?
Yeah. I think key takeaways are we need to reinvent the state of school across this country and across the world. We have a lot of talent in this country that's capable of doing so much. And reinventing has to go through our people. I think 3 is that India has the potential to leapfrog, to not play catch up, but that's going to take us redesigning and asking ourselves, how do we ensure that our schools are vehicles of economic mobility? How do we ensure our schools are preparing kids for the future and not for the past?
Got it.
And I think my fourth and my final would actually be that for anybody wanting to get involved, I would say, volunteer, teach, spend time in communities. But the biggest thing I think we can also be doing is just getting proximate. Getting proximate to communities and to kids. Because when we start to listen, we start to learn, things start to shift. As I look back, I'm sure there are a million things that I would probably do differently. But I think that I would try to spend as much time as I possibly can just getting proximate myself.
What do you mean by that?
I mean that there is a difference between serving and trying to do good work and serving and listening. And I think the more that we can pause to listen to kids and listen to communities, I think the more that we hear about what's needed. And I think the closer we get to a solution. Yeah.
That's very powerful. And I guess all of this needs to start with having the right mindset and having the vision to be able to see that, right?
Yeah.
That this is where we want to get, and then finding ways to do it.
Yeah.
One last question.
Please.
For any parents listening to this and looking for advice on what to teach their kids, can you once again give me 3 main things that I should focus as a parent while I'm raising 2 boys? How can I empower them to work in the right direction, to be able to function as a good human being in their society, and also be able to give back? Like, improve yourself, be able to achieve that economic mobility themselves, and then hopefully someday be able to circle back and give it back to the community.
Yeah.
Hopefully.
I would say 1, help your kids fall in love with learning. Because the more we can all become lifelong learners, the faster we're going to be able to keep reinventing even as the world continues to change. Right? Yuval Harari actually says this beautifully. He says, we're at risk of basically the world changing at a fastest rate than it's ever changed before.
Right.
And the best thing that we can be doing is basically just embracing lifelong learning,
Yeah.
And so how do you fall in love with learning? The second that I would say is, how do you develop awareness for the community around you? Right? And awareness for key issues. How do you develop the capacity to be able to listen? Right? And to be able to basically move beyond silos. And the third is, I would say, agency. The belief actually that those are not just issues that are outside of my control. Those are issues that I have the power to be able to change, not when I become an adult, but even in small doses now. Because if I start to practice it in small doses now, eventually as I get older, I'll start to practice it in very large doses.
So what I'm hearing from you is, first, making sure or trying that they become lifelong learners. Second is the ability to listen.
Yeah.
Listen to your peers, listen to your community, listen to the needs of your community.
Yeah.
And the third thing which you mentioned is that giving them the power, empowering them
Yeah.
to make change.
Precisely.
Very beautiful. Thank you so much, Sandeep. I really enjoyed this conversation with
Yeah,
you.
likewise. Thank you so much for having me.
And I'm glad we were able to sit down together and talk about things that really matter.
Yeah.
I would love to do this again.
Likewise.
Yes. And I am hoping that this podcast would reach parents, would reach educators, policymakers, and we're able to drive some change through this conversation. So thank you so much once again.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me.